Hiroshima, Japan, August the 6th, 1945. At 31,000 feet, the crew of a single American bomber watched in silence as the world below them ceased to exist. One of those men would later describe what he saw. The sight that greeted our eyes was quite beyond what we had expected, because we saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us, with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima. In a single blinding flash, the age of air power reached its terrible conclusion, and the age of atomic warfare began. But the story of how the world arrived at that moment, how a fragile machine of wood and canvas became the most devastating instrument of destruction ever devised, stretches back decades. It is a story of dreamers and engineers, of terrified young pilots and ice-cold strategists. It is a story told in the thunder of 1,000 bomber engines over Cologne, in the scream of a Stuka diving over Poland, in the quiet hum of a Spitfire climbing through English clouds. It is the story of how air power changed everything. During the Great War, there had been no dramatic increase in aircraft speed. The 90 miles an hour achieved by fighters in 1914 rose to only 125 miles an hour by the fighters of 1917 and 18. Aircraft range, however, was vastly extended. When the Frenchman Louis Blériot flew across the 20 miles of the English Channel in 1909, it was considered an amazing feat. Yet exactly 10 years later, two Englishmen, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, succeeded in crossing the Atlantic, crash landing on the Irish coast in their converted Vickers-Vimy bomber. In the 1920s, flying became one of the great spectacles. Pilots like the American Charles Lindbergh and the Englishwoman Amy Johnson trailblazed their way around the world. Airlines followed in their wake, dramatically speeding up communications around the globe and bringing its peoples closer together. Aircraft flew ever faster and ever higher. And as they did, military minds began to see possibilities that would reshape the nature of war itself. The creation of strategic bombing forces during 1914 to 18 cast a long shadow. Military strategists came to believe that the bomber could win wars on its own by striking at the very heart of an enemy nation. But the fighters still had an important role to play, gaining and maintaining air superiority over the ground battle. Up until the mid-1930s, the fighter looked little different from those of the Great War. Wooden construction and twin wings made them slow to climb, making it difficult to intercept bombers before they dropped their payloads. But the metal-framed monoplanes were a different story entirely. They were fast enough to catch the bombers, and they were helped enormously by the introduction of radar, which meant that incoming bombers could be tracked well before they approached their targets. In the 1930s, the bombing of Madrid and Guernica during the Spanish Civil War served to convince people that the bomber would dominate future major wars. This was reinforced by Japanese air attacks on Chinese cities like Shanghai in 1937. The greatest fear was that air forces would employ gas bombs, and so, as the prospect of war grew ever more certain, nations began to equip their civilians with gas masks. By 1939, the world had convinced itself of one terrifying proposition: the bomber would always get through. What no one had yet grasped was just how complex, how costly, and how morally agonizing the reality of air warfare would prove to be. The Messerschmitt Me 109 was the German superior fighter when the war began in 1939. It had already proved itself in Spain during the Civil War. The 109 Emile, which entered service that year, was capable of speeds of over 350 miles per hour. One British test pilot who flew a captured 109 at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough recalled the experience vividly. "We did a comparison trial between this first 109E and a Spitfire Mark II, he said. They were very comparable in their performance, but I thought the 109 going downhill fast was very stiff on controls, much metal strutting and reinforcing around, which restricts your vision very, very much." The German fighter pilots had also developed a highly effective combat formation that gave them a tactical edge in the opening campaigns. The Germans also fielded the twin-engined Me 110, whose role was as a bomber escort. It, too, flew at more than 350 miles per hour, but it lacked the maneuverability of the 109. One Allied pilot was blunt in his assessment. The German thought he was very good. Actually, it was an absolute gift for a single-engine fighter. A German pilot offered a more nuanced view of twin-engine fighters. I don't hold too much from twin engines, because if you get hit in a real combat in one engine and the one engine explodes, then normally the second engine explodes too. During the invasions of Poland and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe achieved air supremacy by destroying opposing air forces on the ground. While it was never wholly successful in this, its fighters outmatched their often obsolete opponents, and air supremacy was quickly achieved. This did much to ensure the success of the ground offensives. But there was one critical failure, and it came against the British Royal Air Force in 1940. The RAF had two fighters which could match those of the Luftwaffe. The rugged Hawker Hurricane could outmaneuver the Me-110, and the Supermarine Spitfire could certainly keep up with the Me-109 at high speed, although it initially lacked firepower. One pilot who flew both during the war offered this comparison. Without doubt, the Spitfire was the glamour puss of the two airplanes. However, the Hurricane could do many things the Spitfire couldn't. If you had a Hun at the rear end of you, or you wanted to make tight evasive action, without doubt the Hurricane could outturn a Spitfire. As far as the Spitfire was concerned, right from the very word go, it had a very much better rate of climb than the Hawker Hurricane. When the Spitfire got its improved engines, it could go to a much greater height. The Me-109 and the Spitfire were evenly matched in performance. The Spitfire's controls were much quicker at high altitude, and the cockpit a lot less cramped. But the 109 carried only enough fuel for just over 1 hour's flying, which seriously limited its combat time over the English coast, and was a considerable drawback. The British radar stations were also becoming increasingly efficient. This, together with an equally efficient command and control system, often enabled the RAF fighters to gain altitude advantage over their opponents. A German pilot who fought in that battle acknowledged the challenge they faced. The real enemy we met in the Channel, the British, with its Spitfire and Hurricane England, had the best air defense concerning the technology of their aircraft and the training of their pilots, as well as their ground defense systems. That caused us a lot of difficulties, and we experienced enormous losses there. But so did the British. One RAF pilot described the grinding toll of those weeks. I did 16 sorties in 6 days. I started asking myself, how long is this going to go on? Because I'd been at it since May the 10th, with very few days off, and I'd been hit twice. You get to a point where you carry on in desperation. And sometimes it works, you come out of it unscathed, and you've learned something. Another experience. We won't get into that predicament again. The Luftwaffe failed in their attack on the radar system, and consequently suffered. The Battle of Britain was the first great defeat inflicted on Hitler's war machine, and it was won in the air. In 1941, following the immense success of RAF Fighter Command, the British launched cross-channel sweeps in order to draw German fighters into the air. The Germans, now operating close to their bases in northern France, had more fuel available for combat than their opponents. Fighter strength in the West was weakened considerably by Hitler's invasion of Russia in June of that year. But during the second half of 1941, the Germans introduced the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190, able to attain a speed of well over 400 miles per hour. At low altitude, it could outmaneuver the Spitfire Mark V. A German pilot explained the 190's advantages. The Focke-Wulf had a very strong engine, and in itself was very robust. The Me-109 had a liquid-cooled engine, which meant that if some shrapnel damaged the cooling system, the 109 couldn't continue, whereas the Focke-Wulf, with its air-cooled system, could. But the aircraft had its weaknesses too. The same pilot admitted some of the shortcomings were that when dive bombing, because of the air-cooled system, depending on the speed, it would open up and affect the stability of the airplane. Sometimes the aircraft would tilt to one side, and you could find yourself in a helpless situation. You had no control over it, and it would be very difficult to right again. Early in 1942 came the appearance of the 109 Gustav, which was to become the backbone of the German fighter arm. It performed especially well at high altitudes, which would matter enormously once the U.S. 8th Air Force began its daylight bombing offensive against occupied Europe in earnest. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the air war had taken on a character of its own. In North Africa, obsolete Italian CR-42 biplanes took off to duel with equally dated British Gloucester Gladiators in the very early months of the conflict. It was a strange echo of the Great War biplanes circling and diving in the desert sky. On Malta, Three gladiators, nicknamed Faith, Hope, and Charity, provided the mainstay of the island's air defense during the early months of the siege. Three aircraft, holding the line against everything the Axis could throw at them. It was an act of defiance that became the stuff of legend. On the other side of the world, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighter dominated the Pacific War during the initial conflict. The Western view that Japanese pilots were not as skillful as their adversaries soon proved dangerously wrong. An American pilot recalled his first encounter. "I was just a young fighter pilot and had been with my squadron only a couple of months, but real eager to get out there and have at the Japs. We were fired up to go, and we had one of the rudest shocks of our lives when we first encountered the Zero. We never expected anything like it. It was such a tremendously maneuverable airplane, it was unbelievable. The first time I had one in my sights, I was just ready to punch the pickle, and away went the Zero, right out of my sight." He paused, then added, "The Zero could outmaneuver us solid, but the Zero could not take any punishment. You got a good burst into a Zero, and it would blow right away. So that was our advantage. Yet 1-for-1, it was a bad day to fight a Zero." At the outbreak of war in 1939, the combatant nations laid down very strict guidelines for their bomber forces. They should only attack military targets, but within 3 weeks of the German invasion of Poland, the Luftwaffe was bombing Warsaw. The justification, according to the Germans, was that the Polish capital had made itself a military target by refusing to surrender. The German attack on Rotterdam in May of 1940 was for the same reason, though it could have been avoided if the message to turn the German bombers back had reached them in time. During the Battle of Britain, the main targets for the German bombers were airfields, radar stations, docks, and aircraft factories. And then came one of those pivotal accidents of war. The Blitz on Britain so very nearly did not happen. It was the result of a navigational error by a German bomber, which dropped its bombs on London by mistake. This led to the RAF's immediate retaliation with a raid on Berlin, and with that, the era of city-busting had begun. Even so, at this stage, the bombers of both sides were still instructed to attack specific targets: munitions, factories, shipyards, rail junctions, but they had severe problems achieving accuracy. One veteran recalled the early days of the RAF bombing campaign. The idea was with mass formations. They would carry out raids on the shipbuilding, naval dockyards, Wilhelmshaven, Kiel, Emden, and so forth. But they were disastrous, because the idea was that mass formations would be self-protective. The bombers in those days, the Whitleys, Hamptons, and Wellingtons, had inadequate defenses in their turrets, and they were pounced on by German 109s. "We had some heavy losses of pre-war professional crews. It was the failure of those tactics that caused Bomber Command to take to night bombing," he added, with the bluntness of hard experience. "I was very doubtful, after our experiences, that the bomber would get through in daylight. They had heavier machine guns than we had. We, for some reason or other, always had nothing but 303. Well, it's rather like a pea shooter against an elephant, a 303 against an armored fighter." By September 1940, the Germans had begun night bombing for the same reason. Navigation, reliant on dead reckoning, suffered. Bomb sites were little different from those of 1918 and just as inaccurate. In the summer of 1941, the British commissioned a study into bombing accuracy, and the results were sobering. Only some 10% of bombers were getting their bombs to within 5 miles of their targets in Western Germany. 5 miles. Something had to be done. It was inevitable that civilians would suffer, as the munitions factories were usually in urban areas or close to them. The question was no longer whether civilians would die, it was how many. Both the Luftwaffe and the RAF had possessed only medium bombers at the outbreak of war types like the Heinkel He-111 and the Vickers Wellington, with limited range and payload. The Germans saw no real need for long-range heavy bombers, thinking only of war against neighboring nations. They did reconsider this decision later, but heavy bombers like the Heinkel He-177 never really got beyond the prototype stage. The RAF, too, initially concentrated on medium bombers to match the Luftwaffe numerically. However, specifications for heavy bombers were drawn up by the late 1930s, and these began to come into service during the first half of 1941. But with the spring of 1942 came an aircraft that was to become one of the most outstanding bombers of the war: the Avro Lancaster. Winston Churchill during this time had seen RAF Bomber Command as the only direct way of striking back at Germany, and reducing the pressure on the Russians. With enough heavy bombers, the RAF could destroy the German economy and, its advocates believed, the morale of her people by attacking her cities. There was, however, a problem. Britain's aircraft needs were not confined to bombers. There was an extreme shortage of maritime patrol aircraft in the Atlantic, desperately needed to keep the U-boats at bay. The production of bombers could not be given absolute priority. In February 1942, RAF Bomber Command received a new chief, Arthur Harris, soon to be nicknamed Bomber Harris. He was a very straight-talking man. He believed, and the air staff supported him, that the policy of city-busting or area bombing could bring Germany to her knees. This would achieve final victory without the massive ground force casualties that an invasion would demand. With this conviction burning like a pilot light, Harris launched the 1,000-bomber raids at the end of May 1942. Contemporary newsreel captured the scale of it. 1,000 planes dropping several thousand tons on Cologne in an hour and a half, using some of the heaviest bombs available. For 95 minutes, every 6 seconds a bomb fell on that city. It was not all high-explosive incendiaries in their thousands set devastating fires across the target. The RAF could not maintain this size of raid and would be unable to do so until mid-1944. But a statement had been made. The war was coming home to Germany. The British bombers had to contend with an ever more effective German air defense. A combination of radars, searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighters were organized in zones covering the approaches to Germany and the major cities. RAF Bomber Command would pay dearly for its attacks because of these defenses. One bomber crew member recalled the terror of the searchlights. One thing we hadn't solved was getting out of searchlights, because they used to put a load of searchlights onto you and do what they called a cone. The problem was to get out of that, because once you were lit up in those days, we were flying about 5,000 or 6,000 feet once you're in there. The gunners on the ground had a target to shoot at, and they used to give you a rather warm time. Another crew member described the night fighter threat. You had to keep your eyes open, because suddenly they come out of the darkness, and you wouldn't know anything until suddenly you've got tracers coming at you. They used to come up from underneath, and that's where lots of aircraft were shot down, because the German fighters had a gun that went straight up. They used to come up underneath the main planes, hit the target, which was the petrol tanks. The whole lot would explode. The losses were staggering. Of every 100 aircrew who embarked on a tour of operations with RAF Bomber Command, 60 would be killed before they had completed the statutory 30 missions. The men who flew these missions carried a burden that statistics alone could never convey. I don't believe anybody who says they weren't frightened at some time or other, one veteran admitted. My principal worry was getting badly hit, so the aircraft burnt. I wasn't too worried about having to get out, if we could get out, but my real worry was either going down in flames, or the wing coming off and then you're really in dead trouble. It was not mere bravery that kept them going. It was something more complicated: duty, stubbornness, and the fierce refusal to let down the men beside them. While the strategic bombers struck at cities and industry, another form of air power was being perfected closer to the ground. The Germans had developed fighter ground attack into a fine art, initially with the Junkers U-87 Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka proved a devastating weapon during the early campaigns, working closely with the panzer formations as aerial artillery. Its siren regularly served to terrify ground troops into panic. The British armed a Hurricane with bombs, calling it a Hurry bomber, during the desert campaigns in North Africa. Both the British and the Germans used their ground attack aircraft as tank busters, equipping them with cannon-firing, armor-piercing ammunition. The Hawker Typhoon, a rocket-firing aircraft, was used extensively during the latter half of the war, especially during the 1944-45 campaign in northwest Europe. In the summer of 1941, the Russians introduced their newly developed Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, which proved a devastatingly effective close-air support aircraft. It was so heavily armored that German pilots struggled to bring it down. As one recalled, you had to aim very actively. A lot of pilots, the whole ammunition was gone, and it was still flying. Air power also transformed the very concept of how troops could be delivered into battle. Development of airborne forces began with the Germans and the Russians in the 1930s. During the invasion of Norway in April 1940, the Germans were the first to use them in action. Their most impressive airborne operation was the invasion of the island of Crete in May 1941, with some 5,000 men being dropped. But the Germans ceased mounting any more such operations on a large scale due to the substantial loss of Juncker's Ju-52 transports. The British and Americans took up where the Germans left off. They began to use airborne forces to spearhead their invasions from November 1942 onwards. The first Allied Airborne Army was formed in the spring of 1944, and their divisions played a major part in the Normandy landings. But perhaps the most ambitious and most tragic airborne operation was Operation Market Garden. The plan was audacious: land troops in front of the ground forces and capture and hold important strategic bridges at Arnhem, Nijmegen, Grave, and in the Eindhoven area. The Germans had flooded large areas of Holland to prevent the movement of ground troops, but they had not bargained for this great airborne assault. And yet, because the ground forces were unable to link up with the British and Polish paratroopers at Arnhem in time, the operation failed. It remains one of the great what-ifs of the war. Harris was by now looking to the Americans, whose 8th Air Force was building up in Britain, to lend weight to the campaign. Its main strength lay in the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. While it did not carry the bomb load of the RAF's Lancaster, it had far more defensive weapons. One B-17 veteran put it simply: the B-17 was an experimental aircraft as far as World War II is concerned. It would take more punishment. I flew B-29s. They wouldn't take anywhere near the punishment of the B-17. It would bring you home on one engine, 2 engines, whatever, half your tail shot off. It was a great airplane. Another American airman was more specific about the difference in doctrine. The British did not believe that we could bomb in daylight. They tried it. It didn't work. But we had what was known as the Norden bomb sight. We had the tight formation. We had the firepower to do it. And we proved it could be done. We bombed the strategic targets by day. The British bombed towns and cities by night. The 8th Air Force B-17 Seconds made their operational debut in mid-August 1942. It was to be some months before they were in sufficient strength to launch major attacks against Germany. In the meantime, they gained operational experience over France and the Low Countries. Early results were very impressive in terms of bombing accuracy due to the Norden bomb sight. In January 1943, the Allies agreed on a combined bombing offensive as a necessary step to final victory over Germany. Point Blank was the code name. The RAF continued to attack by night, while the Americans did so by day. This was called round-the-clock bombing. Point Blank was launched by the RAF in March 1943, with the beginning of what became known as the Battle of the Ruhr, the main industrial region in western Germany, lying against the east bank of the River Rhine. The battle lasted 4 months, but the result was inconclusive. Industrial haze and effective German air defenses were the main reasons. But the RAF also underestimated the Germans' recovery rate from these attacks, and made another mistake in ignoring the fact that the British people themselves had remained resilient under the Blitz. They believed that the Germans would crack under the same pressure. They were wrong. Not all of the RAF attacks were of the city-busting sort. Light and medium bombers made attacks by day to cause surprise, many of them at dangerously low levels. The twin-engined de Havilland Mosquito, with its all-wooden airframe, was particularly effective in this role. Its speed and agility made it almost impossible to intercept, and it could deliver its payload with remarkable precision. The attack on the Gestapo jail at Amiens in northern France proved what the Mosquito could accomplish when flown with audacity and skill. British aircraft designer Barnes Wallis was responsible for the RAF's most spectacular raid of the war against the dams in May 1943. Wallis designed a special type of bomb for this mission, as conventional types would not work. The newly designed bomb would bounce on the water and strike horizontally rather than vertically. A special Lancaster squadron was formed for the operation, which took place on the 16th and 17th of May. 2 of the 3 dams attacked were breached, but 8 out of the 19 aircraft involved failed to return. Even so, the attack provided a major boost to RAF Bomber Command's morale. Towards the end of July 1943, Harris targeted the northern German port city of Hamburg, which he was determined to destroy. Bombers of the 8th United States Air Force joined the assault, roaring across the North Sea in broad daylight. Tons of bombs rained from the skies. Aerial photographs showed the results. 7 square miles of Hamburg's war industries, docks, and military installations flattened and in ruins. Water mains, gas, and electric plants destroyed. Hamburg as a war center, as a base for submarines was virtually wiped off the map. August 1943 was a disastrous month for the American bombers. On the 1st of the month, the 9th Air Force, based in North Africa, launched a low-level attack against the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. The low altitude meant that German radars were unable to spot them on their way to the target, giving the air defenses little or no warning. The bombers reached the oil fields and caused considerable damage. As the campaign continued, its steady pounding whittled away 90% of Romanian oil production. But the return flight was not a success. A third of the 177 B-24 Liberators were lost. Many other bombers were severely damaged. As one veteran said simply, "We hurt them, but they hurt us too." The Ploiești campaign had cost 270 heavy bombers, 49 fighters, and their crews. Each plane and each man helped to shorten the war, but the price was agonizing. Only 2 weeks after Ploiești, the 8th Air Force struck at the Me-109 fighter factory at Regensburg and a ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt. The losses were devastating. 60 of the 376 bombers involved were shot down, and 170 damaged. No Air Force could continue absorbing such casualties. This led to the temporary withdrawal of the 8th Air Force to less dangerous targets on the fringes. In October 1943, the Americans attacked Schweinfurt again. 60 B-17s failed to return. The Americans were losing confidence in daylight attacks and considered switching to night operations. The main problem was brutally clear. Their bombers, although heavily armed, could not defend themselves deep inside Germany. They had dedicated escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, but neither type had the range to accompany the bombers all the way to targets in the German heartland. One veteran reflected on the lessons learned. The concept of hitting them round the clock with daylight and night raids was sound. The problem was that in the early days, we did not have enough bombers and we did not have enough fighters to make deep penetrations into Germany without prohibitive losses. The only thing I could recommend would be to have learned our job a little more slowly and waited a little longer before making the very deep and very damaging penetrations. The answer to this crisis had a name: the P-51B Mustang. Equipped with extra fuel tanks, it began to appear in early 1944, and it changed everything. At last, American fighters could escort their bombers deep into the Reich and back. One P-47 pilot, who also knew the capabilities of his own aircraft, offered this assessment: "We had 8 machine guns in the P-47, which was tremendous firepower compared to the 6 machine guns in the P-51. There was no other fighter in the world with that amount of firepower. It was a sturdy airplane built like a tank, and I could drive it through most anything. It was more than a match for the Focke-Wulf 190. More than a match for the 109. But the P-47, for all its virtues, could not follow the bombers all the way to Berlin. The Mustang could." In the early 1920s, American General Billy Mitchell carried out a series of experiments to demonstrate how effective aircraft could be against ships. The Second World War was to prove Mitchell right beyond anything he might have imagined. The aircraft carrier took over as the Navy's principal weapon from the battleship, transforming the war at sea. But land-based aircraft were just as deadly. The warships themselves were forced to adopt ever stronger anti-aircraft armament in response, and yet aircraft losses remained appallingly high. By the end of 1941, the RAF's anti-shipping squadrons, mainly equipped with the Beaufort torpedo bomber, were suffering a significantly higher casualty rate than any other branch of the service in the Mediterranean. From 1943, the Allies suffered additional shipping losses due to the introduction of Germany's HS-293, a glider bomb that proved extremely effective. The British designed their own anti-shipping weapon, codenamed Highball, which worked on the same principle as the bouncing bomb used in the RAF's famous Dams raid. But Highball was never used in anger. The Royal Navy in the Mediterranean suffered especially from aircraft operating from southern Italy and Sicily in its attempts to keep Malta supplied. During the evacuations of the army from France in 1940 and Crete in 1941, the British lost vast numbers of warships to German air attack. The capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse were lost to Japanese air attack off the Malayan coast in December of 1941. And the German battleship Tirpitz, which had long been a major threat to the supply convoys to Russia, was finally destroyed by heavy British bombers using the amazing 12,000-pound Tallboy, a unique bomb with its fuse in the tail, enabling it to penetrate the ship's armor before detonating. The Battle of the Atlantic was World War II's longest-running campaign, and aircraft played an ever-increasing role. During the first half of the battle, long-range German Focke-Wulf Condors, operating from western France, ranged far and wide over the Atlantic. They directed U-boats onto convoys and themselves attacked ships with success. Allied aircraft, in turn, could spot a U-boat on the surface and direct warships onto them. One crew member explained the logic. Even if you didn't sink a submarine, so long as you could keep them with their heads down first of all, that reduced their range because they couldn't travel very far. I think they only did about 4 knots underwater, as opposed to, say, 12 knots on the surface. A surface U-boat was extremely vulnerable to air attack, and half of the German submarines sunk during the war fell victim to aircraft. The RAF even developed a searchlight system called the Lee Light, mounted on patrol bombers. One pilot who used it described his aircraft. "The airplane I flew was a Mark 14 Wellington, fitted with a 12 million candle power searchlight called a Lee Light, which was lowered from a sort of dustbin contraption at the back of the bomb bay. That was to illuminate submarines, if you found one." May 1943 saw the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, when the Germans were forced to temporarily withdraw their U-boats. This was due mainly to the increasing production of more effective naval weapons, improved anti-submarine tactics, and crucially, aircraft. The very long-range American B-24 Liberator maritime patrol aircraft was instrumental in finally closing the so-called Black Gap, that part of the North Atlantic that could not be covered by land-based aircraft until the B-24 arrived. The Maritime Patrol B-24 had previously been assigned another role, which was considered to be more important, namely, as a strategic bomber. From Leyte to Paramushiro, from France to the Philippines, makers of many of this war's headlines had been B-24 Liberators, and the men who flew and fought them. As one wartime account put it, "The Lib is heroine of many a wing and a prayer story. Flak-gutted B-24 brings back airmen. Lib beats off 8 enemy fighters, comes home on 2 engines." It sounds as if the Liberator comes home itself, while pilot and crew relax and enjoy the ride. But the men who flew safely back from battle in these planes know the B-24's ability to take punishment is only half the story, a good, solid half. But the other half is know-how. It's the sum total of information you have about any plane that will determine whether you can bring it back after it has been badly shot up. Air power also sustained operations in the most inhospitable theaters of war. In Burma, the Allied accomplishment in building a new supply road, the Lido Road into China, was largely made possible by the supply of materials by air. Burma and the Pacific also saw extensive use of resupply by parachute. Deep inside Japanese-occupied territory, the Chindits in 1944 even created makeshift airstrips to fly in troops and supplies. In every theater, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the frozen wastes of the Arctic convoy routes, the transport aircraft had become as vital to the prosecution of war as the bomber and the fighter. The Germans enjoyed air supremacy on the Eastern Front until 1943. Obsolete Soviet types like the Polikarpov 115S and 116S were no match for German fighters. A German pilot recalled those early days. "In my opinion, it was always easier on the Eastern Front. When war broke out, the Russians were not as well trained as us, and their weapons were not as good as ours. The aircraft were not as modern as our 109s and 190s. Consequently, in 1941, the Russians experienced great losses at the beginning, but he added a crucial caveat: this changed very quickly. The Russians never lost their urge for battle, even though they experienced great losses. The strong aeronautical design tradition possessed by the Russians meant that by mid-1943, they were introducing aircraft like the MiG-3, perfectly capable of matching the Luftwaffe. 20,000 British and American aircraft supplied under Lend-Lease proved to be a great asset, and some Western Allied fighter squadrons even fought on the Eastern Front for a time. Thus, the Germans found themselves facing not only improving Soviet designs, but also British Hurricanes, American P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks. The Eastern Front, which had seemed so easy in '41, had become a relentless war of attrition. By 1944, with the P-51 Mustang escorting American bombers deep into Germany, and the RAF introducing the Hawker Tempest, which, like later versions of the Thunderbolt, could fly at over 450 miles per hour, the balance of air power had shifted decisively. The strategic bombing forces in Britain were passed to Eisenhower's command in order to prepare for the cross-channel invasion, while the bomber barons American Carl Spaatz and Britain's Arthur Harris believed it was a mistake to switch their attacks from Germany. The contribution they made to the success of Operation Overlord was immense. They destroyed the Nazi defenses, special anti-invasion weapons, gun positions, E-boat pens and hideouts, the defenses that Hitler had been building and strengthening the length of the Atlantic Wall. They destroyed railway centers, engine repair shops, and rolling stock, hindering the movement of German troops and supplies. Hitler would have to rely on the network of railways in occupied Europe to move reinforcements rapidly to wherever the Allies attacked. The aim of the Allied air forces was to ensure those railways could not carry the load. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, the German Air Force was conspicuous by its absence during the days following the landings. For this, the world owed a debt to the squadrons of Fighter Command, who kept up a non-stop watch over the beaches and convoys. Between June 6 and June 12, 10,000 sorties were flown. By D+4, the first landing strip was available to Allied fighters for refueling and emergency landings. The skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. In the autumn of 1943, RAF Bomber Command had opened a third major offensive under Point Blank, this time against Berlin itself. It was to be the grimmest battle of the air war, due to the formidable defenses around the German capital. Berlin was attacked several times during the winter of 43 to 44, but hopes that the RAF could achieve another Hamburg were in vain. Bomber losses rose drastically as the battle wore on. Berlin, although bruised, was not destroyed. For RAF Bomber Command, it was a battle lost. In September 1944, the bombers returned to Germany in force. Oil was now the top priority, although city busting continued. The production of nearly half of Germany's liquid fuel and almost all of its aviation gasoline was concentrated in just 8 huge synthetic oil plants. All were vulnerable, for they could not be dispersed and relocated like aircraft factories. Their machinery was complicated, the process continuous, and stores of hydrogen and fuel made the plants highly inflammable. Heavy attacks stopped production completely until damage could be repaired. As the Luftwaffe continued to attack bombers in the air, the large numbers of Mustangs now in the sky made success ever harder to achieve. Germany's infrastructure was being steadily destroyed, but it was the attack on Dresden in February 1945 which brought the morality of area bombing to the fore. 1,350 American bombers of the 8th Air Force streaked their vapor trails into the dawn. For 2 full days, miles of bombers hammered the city, which lay near the advancing Russian front. They hit Dresden hardest of all. The city had virtually no targets of military significance, yet much of it was destroyed and 50,000 lives were lost. Even so, the bombers continued to blitz Germany until the very end of the war. Arthur Harris remained defiant. "We propose to entirely emasculate every enemy center of war production if necessary. We are well on the way now to that end." During this time, larger types of bombs were used, ranging from the 8,000-pound type to the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, which the RAF used against viaducts and other difficult targets. 1944 saw the advent of the jet fighter. The German prototype Heinkel He 178 was the very first jet aircraft, having actually flown as early as August 1939. RAF officer Frank Whittle had been working on jet engines in Britain for many years before his Gloucester Whittle first flew in May 1941. But it was the British Meteor that first saw operational service, engaging German V-1 flying bombs. Germany's great hope was the Messerschmitt Me 262. A pilot who flew it recalled the experience. The performance and the flight characteristics were so overwhelming. The impression of jet flight first time in a pilot's life is something extra, but then came one of those decisions that may have altered the course of the war. When Hitler saw this aircraft for the first time, the pilot recalled, he asked Messerschmitt, "I was present at this time. Is this aircraft able to carry bombs?" And Messerschmitt said yes. Hitler asked, "How many kilos?" "Perhaps 500 for sure, 250. And Hitler said, "This is the Blitz bomber, the fighter bomber which I have been requesting. With this aircraft, I can fight the coming invasion." And this was the death sentence for this aircraft being used as a fighter, as the interceptor it really was. The Me 262 was delayed into service as a result. Other German innovations included the Me 163 Comet rocket plane, reaching a speed of almost 600 miles per hour but with only enough fuel for 90 seconds of flight. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was the jet fighter introduced by the Americans, but although two were sent to Italy in the spring of 1945, it entered service too late to see action. In the war in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Japanese used their bombers to spearhead their Oriental blitzkrieg. They did not see bombing as decisive in its own right, but air attacks on the Philippines, Singapore, and elsewhere undoubtedly shattered the morale of the defenders. The Allies, on the other hand, were out of range of mainland Japan for much of the war. Before June 1944, only one air attack was made on Japan, the strike by B-25 bombers from the carrier Hornet in April 1942. It was no more than a morale raiser for the Americans, a gesture of defiance rather than a blow of substance. It was not until the massive Boeing B-29, which could carry a 20,000-pound bomb load over 3,000 miles, came into service in 1944 that land-based American bombers could reach Japan. The B-29 was first sent to India and to bases in southern China, making its first attack on Japan from China on the 15th of June, 1944. The Japanese then launched an attack into southern China, and the B-29 bases had to be evacuated. However, in the midsummer of that year, the capture of Saipan and Tinian in the Marianas Islands gave the B-29 alternative bases within range of Japan just 1,465 miles from Tokyo. Towards the end of November, they resumed high-altitude attacks. The results, in terms of bombing accuracy, were disappointing. Japanese fighters were shooting down and damaging an increasing number of B-29 Cess, not without cost to themselves. The B-29 force then made a fateful decision, switched to night bombing and attack at low level, hoping to improve accuracy. Since many Japanese houses were built of wood, incendiaries made up most of the bomb load. The first of these attacks was made against the Japanese capital, Tokyo, on the night of the 9th and 10th of March, 1945. The result was devastating. 2 square miles of the city totally destroyed. This led to attacks on other Japanese cities. Iwo Jima, captured at the end of March 1945, brought Japan within P-51 Mustang range and meant that the B-29s could resume daylight raids joined now by B-17s. The bombing of Japan continued throughout the summer of 1945, destroying much of the remaining industry. The Japanese began to make signs for peace, but would not accept unconditional surrender. A large proportion of the population wanted to fight on to the bitter end, despite the obliteration of their cities. This led to the decision to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki, and consequently, surrender. It could be argued that the pre-war air theorists had finally been vindicated. The crew of the Hiroshima mission saw it with their own eyes, that cloud of boiling dust and debris, that tremendous mushroom, and beneath it, the ruins of an entire city. Arthur Harris, to the end of his days, maintained his belief in the bomber's power. "There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war," he said. "Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. Germany will make a most interesting initial experiment. Japan will provide the confirmation. However, it was the weapon and not the delivery system which had proved decisive. The future capability of the atomic bomb was to prove immense, and with that, the nature of warfare itself was transformed forever. The long strategic bombing offensive against Germany was not decisive on its own. It failed to break the morale of the German people. It could not prevent German war production from peaking during late 1943, and the cost in bombers and in the lives of aircrew was staggering. One veteran recalled the early toll with painful precision. "We lost 100 Blenheims in the first 12 months of the war, because we started losing 5 out of 10 on the first bombing raid of the war." An American bomber crew described one ill-fated mission in particular. The command decided they would try an experiment very early in the war, go in under radar, down low, and not fly at high altitude. They came in at a very low altitude and tried to fool the Germans. It didn't fool the Germans at all. We got the living hell knocked out of us. That was the last low-altitude flight they ever flew in a B-17. The same was true on every front, on every side, in every cockpit and every turret. The men and women who fought this war in the air, from the Spitfire pilots over Kent to the B-29 crews over Tokyo, from the Il-2 pilots on the Eastern Front to the Coastal Command, crews hunting U-boats in the Atlantic, All of them faced odds that no training could fully prepare them for. One American recalled, "On that particular flight, we went in at 8,000 feet instead of going in normally at 25,000 feet. And it was much too low, much too easy a target for the anti-aircraft guns." Another veteran spoke for all of them when he said, "Flying was dangerous. It was much more dangerous than before the war. And you didn't like the idea of being killed. Especially you didn't like the idea of being burned to pieces or just burned and surviving." Some came home, many did not. And those who survived carried the memories with them for the rest of their lives. However, the bombing offensive did make a significant contribution to the defeat of Hitler's Germany, a contribution that compensated, in the grim arithmetic of war, for the high losses in men and aircraft. Air power did not win the Second World War alone, but it is impossible to imagine that war being won without it. From the canvas biplanes of 1914 to the atomic fire over Hiroshima, the story of air power in the 20th century is a story of extraordinary ingenuity, extraordinary courage, and extraordinary destruction. It is a story that must be told and remembered, because its lessons have not grown less urgent with the passing of time. Because remembering is not just an act of respect, it is an act of defense against the forgetting that allows history to repeat itself.